Hi, we're here from Occupy Sydney. We've got with us here McKenzie Wark, who is the author of The Beach Beneath the Street, The Everyday Life and Glorious Times of the Situationists International. He's also an expert in social movements from the New School in New York. Welcome, McKenzie.
Thank you.
Excuse me, my phone.
Speaking of social media.
Okay, so we're here. I just wanted to start off, if you could possibly give us a brief rundown of the central idea of the Society of the Spectacle and the Situationists, and what do you think are the main components or exponents of those ideas in society today?
Well, I think there's maybe worth mentioning three key ideas in the current context. First is the situationist idea of dérive, which is a way of trying to experience the city outside of the division between work time and leisure time. So there are ways of, and I'll use the term, occupying space that can imagine a different kind of city and a different way of inhabiting not only these built environments but of building others.
Yeah.
The second idea is détournement, or the drift or appropriation. It's the idea that culture always already belongs to everybody. So how can you act as if culture is not private property? It's something that you can appropriate. So when Guy Debord writes The Society of the Spectacle, there's whole chunks that are straight up plagiarized from other books. It's not plagiarism because he's not trying to pretend it's his. It's that it's ours. It belongs to all of us. So is there a way of moving from doing that with text to doing that with space and with cities and so on? That then becomes the idea. And the third that you mentioned at the outset is the idea of spectacle, which it's not just television and Twitter or whatever. It's the idea that our social relations are mediated by images, and that all that we're supposed to desire is in this other realm, of pictures, of spectacle, and so forth. And it's, if you like, the separation between work and desire is what the spectacle is essentially about. And is there a way to put the two back together so that what you actually do is what you actually want to do?
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I think there's a couple of issues that need to be teased out from that. The one about the impact on physical space. How do you think that these kind of movements, the Occupy movements worldwide, are affecting the way that people interact within the geography and architecture of a space like Martin Place?
Yeah, I think that's really key. And I wrote a piece called How to Occupy an Abstraction. And part of that was to argue that an occupation is actually, in some ways, the opposite to a social movement. Social movements sort of presuppose you agree in advance to certain demands, and there's a certain homogeneity to whoever is advancing them. And then you just randomly march down some street and it doesn't sort of matter which one. Whereas the idea of an occupation is in fact essentially about space. Is there ways of reimagining these allegedly public spaces as really being public spaces? What would that mean? And you sort of actually press on the contradiction that if you actually use a public space to be the public, the police surround you as if it's not supposed to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me would be one of the central, sort of interesting interventions that the idea of the occupation has come about. One should say that occupation completely changes its meaning. The United States is occupying Afghanistan. That's usually how you would use this in a sentence.
Yeah.
So for the idea for the people to occupy the United States or Australia is, if you like, to reverse the meaning of a term, as Jean Baudrillard would say. So that's, if you like, the second piece that's relevant. The third is that you can't really occupy Wall Street. Right? You can't even really occupy Australia. These things are abstractions.
Yep.
So what's the relation between an action in an embodied physical space and the underlying abstraction? And then how can you, through the occupation of a particular place, then, if you like, send that out and repurpose the social media spaces we have access to as well?
Fantastic. Well, on the social media perspective, when you have such a multiplicity of voices through new media movements, what challenges do you see in steering the course of a movement like this? And to what extent do you believe that media outlets that represent the directives of the General Assemblies that we're forming here should be given the mouthpiece, or should we just let the social media run its course?
I mean, it's a bit of both. It's a question of trying to think what are the strengths and weaknesses of each particular kind of media form. I mean, Twitter I find a real mixed blessing in the sense that it's, among other things, really good for rumour. Like rumour circulates. It's really good for wild speculation. It's really good for really bad reporting of things that actually didn't happen. And I suspect it would be really good for sort of fifth elements and that sort of stuff, agent provocateurs. If you want to get paranoid about it, you can see how, gee, that would be just so easy to do.
Definitely.
We know in Tahrir Square that sort of stuff happened. So I think people need a real education in how to use and read those sorts of things. It can have a lot of uses, but can also really not be all that helpful. Like sometimes you want to be a little discreet. Not everyone has to know everything that everyone says and does. On the other hand, you know, how do you craft and fashion different kinds of communication with the available tools? It's really worth paying attention to the details of that, such that you've got some sort of mix between the openness of forums where everybody gets to be heard and gets to express themselves, but on the other hand, you're trying to manage noise and disinformation a little bit as well. There's no such thing as complete freedom of information. You get too much noise and disinformation in that. On the other hand, you don't want it to be a controlled channel. So it's sort of negotiating those boundaries is the art. That's the movement, really.
On that regard, what do you see the role of pre-existing kind of political structures that maybe want to do participate in this movement? Where do you think their role kind of fits in?
Yeah, and it became a big question in Occupy Wall Street very quickly. And I can't speak for anybody except the sense I had of how people felt on the occasion. But I think people were genuinely very happy that the unions came on the 5th of October. And, you know, these are folks with families and stuff, and they came and they did what they do and they went home, and then there's people occupying the square who are a different crowd, you know, so it's people acknowledging that they're different, but also acknowledging that there's a shared cause, and that worked really well. On the other hand, there's much less enthusiasm for things like MoveOn.org. Doing fundraising. It's like, well, no one asked you to raise money for us. We don't really need any money. You know, we have what we need. People bring food, you know. Stop with the pizza. We need better food. You know, it's more about that. So I think there's a very, very tricky space to create alliances without being co-opted is a very, very difficult needle to thread. But generally I think it's a good thing that, you know, with the union guys, it was like they kind of woke up and thought, you know, we must follow them for we are their leaders. You know, there's the sense that their own rank and file that pushed them to do it. So, you know, in a sense, this can be a positive dynamic, that social movements press on the political structure from the outside to change the internal geometry of what's possible. But you don't necessarily want to get sucked into it at the same time. So it's standing on the edge of a vortex, shaping that vortex and trying not to get sucked in. You know, that might be, if you like, the metaphor for it.
Yeah. In that regard, what do you see the role as intellectuals and academics can play in the movement in terms of steering its course or pursuing new ideas when they have the opportunity to do it in such a public kind of environment?
I mean, different people have different sorts of roles. I mean, I wrote 2 pieces about Occupy Wall Street as a reporter. I just really wanted to go and do a sort of intellectual journalism, you know, like what are the concepts that are emerging out of this? So I wrote 2 pieces for Verso, and it's on their website. And I'm just an anonymous person. I'm just another person who's there. I can't stay overnight because I've got small kids, so I, like, you know, take my kid to school and go down to the park, and then I'm there, and then I have to go pick up my kid, you know, because I'm a, you know, bourgeois middle class person. So this is something I can do, but I can write about it, and you know, I know something about the history of this going back 40, 50 years, so I can try and put it in that context. There's another role for Slavoj Žižek to turn up and be the kind of sacred monster and do his act, you know, and this is kind of galvanizing. But I think that's a kind of separate thing, and there's a use to that. Or for Cornel West to come and do, he does a slightly different thing, but it's to channel the spiritual tradition in the United States and bring that and testify. So yeah, I think there are different. Michael Moore comes and, you know, the cameras will come to be on him, and he'll say, "You shouldn't be filming me." Well, of course they're filming you because you're Michael Moore, you know. So there's a weird dialectic about all that. But personally, I thought to just try to report on it was the thing that was really needed. And the one thing I don't really like, and you see so much of this, is statements by intellectuals about what the occupation movement ought to do. I'm just so fucking tired of that I wanted to not do that and just say what I thought it was doing and what was novel about what it was doing.
Yeah, so having more of a reporting role than actually trying to steer the course of it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not necessarily reporting in the Sydney Morning Herald style. Yep. It's sort of like, this is, I think, it's the emergent concepts that are here, in terms of the history of social movements.
Yep. I'll just go back to the Situationists for a second. They were quite negative towards art from an intellectual properties perspective. Obviously, the culture is of the people, and everybody's free to make culture as they see fit. One of the main criticisms of this movement coming through the media is that it is just a transplant from the US, obviously because it did start from Egypt, but one of the major influences has been the Wall Street movement. How do you see this Occupy movement affecting those questions of ownership and copyright?
I think it's two separate things there. I mean, as an Australian, I'm really sensitive to that, that sense of we frickin' import everything. Yep. We have to import social movements as well. But to really stress that, this is a sort of a transnational thing. That it doesn't have a point of origin, And there's a sense in which Wall Street doesn't belong to America. That's the whole point, is that it's a node in a global space. It's a node in an abstraction. And you can occupy that. And you're occupying part of a global media abstraction when you do it. It's got nothing to do with, being in America or whatever. So it doesn't quite work symbolically as powerfully elsewhere, to be frank. Wall Street is Wall Street, but I think it's really important to just, in the same way that, feminism is an international movement, and it plays out in really different ways, and it's important to know that Western feminists cannot tell feminists in other parts of the world what to do and think, but nevertheless it's an international movement. That's really important. The other question has got to do with what's the transition between Guy Debord writing a book that's made up of other texts to the fact now that there's a whole media sphere where people cut and paste images and stories from each other all over the planet, and that's a kind of mixed blessing, because everything that's on YouTube, Google is collecting the rent. Nothing you can do about that. So you occupy as much of it as you can, and so rather than look at cute cat videos, let's share images and stories about attempting to create a social practice. One's always operating in the space of commodified desire, but trying to carve out realms that point to another way of life within that space. And the Situationists were talking about this 60 years ago, and there's something very, very prescient in that.
Awesome. I might just track back for a second. You have written, when you were speaking about feminism, you have written about the role that marginal groups do play in these kind of occupation movements as they progress. How do you see it more? How do you see it possible to include everybody and to keep it as equal as possible as the movement kind of gains more speed and grows?
I mean, I think it was brilliant that who came up with the idea that we're the 99%, and because it immediately makes it a class thing, and particularly in the States, that's a rarity. I think even in Australia, it's rare for people to sort of think about it in class terms. And it's weird to have it as a percentage, kind of thing. And when you actually start to look at the statistics of who's in the 1%, it's like, oh my God, I never really thought about that, And then you start looking at not the 1%, but the 0.01%. It's like, holy crap, those guys have a lot of money, And the, however many hundred of them there are in New York City, they live in particular places. You can actually map it and figure it out, People actually went on a tour of the Upper West Side to chant in front of people's houses. It's like, oh my God, this makes it very real. There's a physical embodiment of that. I think to return it to class is very important, to kind of not make it about identity. It's kind of helpful. But it is also worth bearing in mind that there is a kind of unrepresentative nature of who is claiming to be the 99%. Because, here in Australia, we're still part of the 1% in terms of the planetary distribution of wealth, and it's worth keeping that perspective in mind as well.
It's a relative term.
Yeah, exactly. But to not get too bogged down in it, I really resist this language of privilege, because I think it's reactionary. It's this Christian language that you should always be thankful for your privilege. It's like, well, compared to who? Compared to, folks who own, gazillions of frickin' dollars. I'm not that privileged, and so we're in the 99% here, but we're in the 1% siding with the 99% somewhere else to try to keep that set of relations in mind.
Awesome. As this movement is quite small, and obviously we're in a public space and we're bounded by public laws and stuff, we are trying to keep this area drug and alcohol free. You have written extensively on the role that those kind of substances do play in these kind of cultural movements. How can you see those kind of ideas and policies enacting out within this movement?
It's obviously just common sense that you wouldn't want, everybody getting loaded up here in Martin Place, or the law would descend with righteous vengeance here as they would in New York City. So that's just common sense that it's what you would do. On the other hand, there was a wonderful, I didn't personally get to go because I was home with the kids, but it looked like a wonderful festival atmosphere in Times Square, which was, an occupation of this, sort of tourist zone by people who maybe had a couple of beers before they went, and had a quite different kind of vibe when you look at it. But, the thing about Situationists International is that it doesn't come out of, sort of respectable students who went to school and studied hard and became famous professors. It comes from the margins. It comes from Bohemia, and I'm kind of interested in that as a space where people attempt to invent new practices of everyday life, but then also think about it and make that conceptual. Bohemia is a great places for producing art, but they rarely become theoretical, and the Situationists International was one that did. Another that did was the Sydney Push, or the Sydney Libertarians, and I was much too young to have been involved in that, but I grew up around folks who had, and to me that was a wonderful learning experience. These people had steered around the kind of institutional spaces to some extent and come up with this repertoire of ways of living.
Just going on to the Sydney Push, a lot of that push was centred around, Surrey Hills, Darlinghurst, Paddington. Those areas have since become quite heavily gentrified, and they are unaffordable. And to have a viable Bohemia, you do need to have affordable living space. That obviously, Bohemian areas are definitely moving out towards Newtown and Marrickville, and possibly even a little bit further. How do you see those kind of spatial dynamics playing out within cities over time as movements like these do gain strength?
Yeah, it's important, is being able to, and there's probably a few variables, like, cheap rent is clearly one of them. I moved to Sydney in 1980 when no one wanted to live in the city, and you could live here very, very cheaply. And your neighbours were mostly migrants from other countries who, for some reason white folks didn't want to be there, but it was just you'd enter into these communities and, negotiate your way.
Do you want to give a shout out to your suburb that you lived in 1980?
Well, there were a few, but Chippendale was the central one. I actually lived on City Road for a while with the buses thundering around the corner. So the thing is, I don't want to be nostalgic though about the good old days, because I think these things continually reinvent themselves just elsewhere, and I'm too old to know where they are in Sydney. I vaguely know where they are in New York City through my students. The one thing is that cheap rent's one variable. There's things to do with transport and people's access to each other. When you get pushed to the periphery, that sort of thing gets a little harder. And often you find there's little satellite parts of a city that are hard to connect to each other. Because to get from that satellite to this one, you have to pass through the middle and all this stuff. So, there's issues about whether it's not suburbs, but entire cities that now become gentrified and off limits, and that's a question. I don't think it's happened to New York, but it's a question to whether you really ought to move to Philadelphia at some point and start all over again.
Philadelphia's a great city.
Yeah, people call it the sixth borough. A lot of folks just gave up New York and go there. It's only a couple of hours on the train.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure we could talk all day, but we might wrap it up there. Do you have any final remarks or any words of encouragement for all the guys out here?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here in Martin Place while it is occupied, and my heart goes out to everybody who's been involved in sticking it out, and may good things come to pass.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.